There's a stretch of highway in Texas that locals don't talk about much anymore. Not because they've forgotten you never forget something like this, but because the weight of remembering can crush you if you're not careful. Interstate 45 between Houston and Galveston. They call it many things. The Gulf Freeway, the Coastal Corridor, but those who know its darker history call it by another name, the Texas Killing Fields. Since the early 1970s, more than 30 bodies have been recovered along this 50-mile stretch of asphalt. Most of them, young women. Most of them girls. Really. Between the ages of 12 and 25, some shared similar physical features, similar hairstyles, similar dreams of becoming something more than what Texas City or League City or Galveston could offer. The refineries belch flame into the Gulf Coast sky. The bayous hide their secrets in murky waters. The oil fields stretch endlessly, their rusted equipment standing like skeletal sentinels over ground that has seen too much. This is a place where you can disappear, where someone can make you disappear. But this isn't a story about all 30 victims. This is the story of one girl. One girl whose death would eventually save hundreds of lives. One girl whose name would become Texas law. Her name was Krystal Jean Baker. And before I tell you how she died, I need to tell you about the peculiar coincidence of her bloodline, because sometimes truth is stranger than fiction. Krystal Jean Baker was born in 1982. Her mother, Moneta Jeannie Escamilla, chose the name carefully, Krystal with a K, a unique spelling for a girl she hoped would have a unique life. But there was something else unique about Krystal Baker. Something that would later fascinate true crime enthusiasts and casual observers alike, though it had nothing to do with her death. Krystal Jean Baker was the great-grandniece of Marilyn Monroe. Yes, that Marilyn Monroe. The connection came through her paternal line. Marilyn Monroe's birth name was Norma Jean Baker, the same Baker family name. Krystal's great-great-grandfather was Jasper Newton Baker, born in 1886. Jasper had been briefly married to Gladys Monroe, Marilyn's mother, before Marilyn was born. After divorcing Gladys, Jasper remarried a widow named Maggie Hunter Mills. They had a son who married a woman with the surname Leathers, and it was their son, Johnny Dale Baker, who became Krystal's father. Marilyn Monroe had a half-sister named Bernice Baker Miracle, and Bernice was Krystal's great-aunt. They shared the same great-grandfather. The two women, Marilyn and Bernice, didn't even know about each other until around 1940, but after that, they maintained a relationship until Marilyn's death in 1962, exactly 20 years before Krystal was born. When Krystal smiled, you could see it, that faint echo of Hollywood glamour in her features. The way her eyes crinkled. The curve of her cheekbones. People mentioned it sometimes. The resemblance to Norma Jean. To Marilyn. But Krystal Jean Baker wasn't destined for Hollywood. She was a Texas City girl through and through. And on March 5, 1996, at the age of 13, just weeks away from her 14th birthday, she would become another statistic in the Texas killing fields. Or so everyone thought. The morning started with an argument. Krystal was staying at her grandmother's house in Texas City. Her mother, Jeannie, would later describe her daughter as having a heart of gold, but also acknowledged that Krystal was a typical teenager with a rebellious streak. On that Tuesday morning in March, that rebellious streak was on full display. The details of the argument aren't public record, some family wounds remain private, but the outcome was clear. Krystal, angry and defiant, stormed out of her grandmother's house. She walked several blocks to a convenience store. She needed to use the phone. Picture this. It's 1996. Cell phones exist, but they're expensive, clunky things carried by businessmen and drug dealers. Regular 13-year-old girls use payphones, landlines. They scrawl phone numbers in the margins of notebooks and memorize their best friend's digits. Krystal called her mother first. Jeannie Escamilla answered. Her daughter's voice was upset, maybe crying. Jeannie did what any mother would do. She told Krystal to go back to her grandmother's house, to stay there, to wait for things to cool down. But Krystal didn't want to go back. Not yet. She made another call, this time to a friend. She was hoping to get a ride to Bayou Vista, just a short distance away. Maybe she could stay there for a while, maybe until the anger faded, until she felt ready to go home. Someone at the convenience store later remembered seeing her at the payphone, talking, waiting. A young girl in a dress on a March afternoon in Texas City, near Interstate 45. And then Krystal Jean Baker vanished. 2 hours later, fishermen discovered a body. The location was the Trinity River Bridge on Interstate 10 in Chambers County, a neighboring county, not where Krystal disappeared. The bridge spans the Trinity River, and beneath the eastbound lanes, down by the gravel shoulder of the feeder road, lay the body of a young girl. She'd been beaten, her face was badly damaged, her dress was pulled up, suggesting sexual assault. There were marks on her neck, ligature marks. She'd been strangled with something. Something like a leather strap. The fishermen called the police. The Chambers County Sheriff's Office arrived. Texas Rangers were brought in. The Texas City Police Department was notified. But here's where the system began to fail Krystal Jean Baker. Because she was found in a different county from where she went missing, her body was initially listed as a Jane Doe. 2 hours. She'd been missing for only 2 hours, and her body had already been found, but the bureaucratic machinery of multi-jurisdictional law enforcement meant that for a brief, crucial window, nobody connected the missing girl from Texas City with the dead girl, found 20 miles away. When the connection was finally made, when her family was finally notified, it had already been hours. Jeannie Escamilla received the call that no mother should ever receive. The investigation began immediately, but it hit walls fast. Evidence was collected. The girl's dress, still on her body. Fingernail scrapings, Krystal had fought back. Fibers, hair, biological samples from the scene. The medical examiner confirmed sexual assault, though curiously, no semen was recovered initially. This detail would later become crucial. But in 1996, DNA technology was still relatively new. CODIS, the Combined DNA Index System, had only been established nationwide in 1998. Many smaller jurisdictions didn't have the resources or training to properly collect and preserve DNA evidence. They did what they could. They interviewed witnesses. They canvassed the convenience store. They tried to trace Krystal's movements. But nobody had seen who picked her up. Nobody saw the vehicle. Nobody could identify a suspect. Kevin Edison Smith's name didn't come up. Why would it? He was nobody. A refinery worker. A welder. He'd graduated from Ball High School in Galveston. He'd lived near Krystal at the time. But he was just another face in Texas City. Just another transient worker moving from refinery to refinery along the Gulf Coast. And so, the case went cold. 14 years. That's how long Jeannie Escamilla waited. That's how long she wondered if her daughter's killer would ever face justice. That's how long Krystal Jean Baker remained just another unsolved murder in a region already notorious for unsolved murders. The Texas killing fields claimed her, just like it had claimed Laura Miller and Heidi Fye and Shelley Sykes and Audrey Cook and Donna Prudhomme and Jessica Kane and so many others. The list kept growing. The cases kept going cold. But something was happening in forensic science. Something that would change everything. DNA technology was advancing rapidly. What couldn't be detected in 1996 could be detected in 2009. What couldn't be analyzed then could be analyzed now. Touch DNA, YSTR profiling, improved extraction techniques for degraded samples. In Chambers County, there was a sheriff's office evidence officer named Sherry Wilcox. And Sherry Wilcox refused to let Krystal Baker's case gather dust. In February of 2009, Deputy Wilcox pulled Krystal's evidence from storage, the dress, the fingernail scrapings, everything that had been carefully preserved 14 years earlier. She resubmitted it all to the Texas Department of Public Safety Crime Lab in Austin. Nothing came back. She tried again in December of 2009. Still nothing. The CODIS database was growing every day, but it only worked if your suspect's DNA was in the system. And Kevin Edison Smith's DNA wasn't in the system. Not yet, but it was about to be. Kevin Edison Smith was 44 years old when Livonia, Louisiana police arrested him on a drug charge. It wasn't a major arrest, a misdemeanor. The kind of charge that might result in a fine, probation, maybe a few weeks in parish jail. Kevin Edison Smith probably thought it was no big deal. He'd been arrested before. This was routine. But Louisiana had something Texas didn't have, a law requiring DNA collection upon arrest for certain offenses. In Texas, you only had to submit DNA after conviction. But Louisiana said, if we arrest you, we're taking your DNA now. We're not waiting for a jury to decide. We're not waiting for you to post bail and disappear. We're swabbing your cheek right now, and we're uploading that profile to CODIS immediately. On January 14, 2010, someone in Livonia, Louisiana, collected a DNA sample from Kevin Edison Smith using a simple cheek swab. They sent it to a lab. The lab processed it, and the profile was uploaded to CODIS. And CODIS said, match. On September 15, 2010, Deputy Sherry Wilcox received a phone call that would change multiple lives forever. Kevin Edison Smith's DNA from the Louisiana arrest had matched DNA evidence recovered from Krystal Jean Baker's murder scene 14 years earlier. The match wasn't preliminary. It wasn't probabilistic. According to testimony that would later be presented at trial, it would take 1 billion planets with the same human population as Earth before finding someone other than Kevin Edison Smith who would match that DNA profile. 1 billion Earths. It was him. An arrest warrant was issued immediately. But where was Kevin Edison Smith? The arrest in Louisiana had been 8 months earlier. Had he fled? Did he know they were coming? No. On September 22, 2010, exactly 1 week after the DNA match was confirmed, investigators located Kevin Edison Smith in Groves, Texas, staying at a Best Value Inn. He was at work, welding at another refinery. Captain Brian Goetzkius of the Texas City Police Department was there for the arrest. Years later, he would recall that Smith appeared calm. He appeared like he didn't have any idea they were coming. Smith was transported to Chambers County and booked into jail. Bond was set at $1 million. On September 24, 2010, the Texas City Police Department held a press conference. Jeannie Escamilla was there, flanked by her surviving children. Captain Goetzkius was there. Reporters from Houston to Galveston packed the room. I wish I could wake up out of this terrible nightmare and hold my little girl in my arms again, Jeannie told the press, her voice breaking. None of this is going to bring her back, but he needs justice. She added something else, something that would prove prophetic. I think this is the beginning of solving a lot of crimes. To tell you the truth, this man has traveled, and there's no telling what he's done. Kevin Edison Smith didn't confess immediately. For weeks after his arrest, he maintained his silence. A court-appointed defense attorney advised him of his rights. The death penalty was on the table. This was capital murder, sexual assault and murder of a child. Texas executes people for less. But then, the prosecutors made a decision. District Attorney Cheryl Leak, later Cheryl Leak Henry, and her team agreed to take the death penalty off the table in exchange for information. Not just about Krystal Baker, about other cases. Other girls. Other bodies found along Interstate 45. Because everyone suspected what Jeannie Escamilla had intuited. Kevin Edison Smith hadn't stopped with Krystal. The timeline of Smith's movements over the previous 13 years was damning. According to CBS News, between the time of Krystal's murder and his arrest, Kevin Edison Smith had lived and worked in 17 different cities across 4 different states. 17 cities, 4 states. How many of those cities had unsolved murders? How many had missing girls? How many had bodies found near highways? So the prosecutors made the deal. Talk, and we won't seek your execution. Stay silent, and we'll push for the needle. In October of 2010, Kevin Edison Smith confessed. In a videotaped interview that would later be played at trial, Smith admitted to picking up Krystal Jean Baker from near the convenience store in Texas City. He claimed he'd been rained out of work that day at the refinery, a welder sitting in his vehicle, waiting for the weather to clear, when he saw a girl walking alone. He offered her a ride. She accepted. According to Smith's confession, they engaged in oral sex. He claimed it was consensual, though how a 44-year-old man could claim consensual sexual activity with a 13-year-old girl requires a special kind of moral bankruptcy. He denied vaginal penetration. He said she became angry afterward. She started freaking out on me, he said, so he strangled her. He used a leather strap. He choked the life out of Krystal Jean Baker while she fought back, hence the DNA under her fingernails. He watched her die, and then he drove her body to Chambers County, to that spot beneath the Trinity River bridge that he must have scouted earlier or known about from his years working refineries in the area. He dumped her like garbage on the gravel shoulder. He pulled her dress up to make it look like something even more brutal had occurred, perhaps to throw off investigators, perhaps because depravity has its own internal logic that defies understanding. And then Kevin Edison Smith drove away and went back to his life. For 14 years. The trial began on April 23, 2012, in the 334th District Court in Anahuac, Chambers County. Judge Carroll E. Wilborn, Jr., presiding. Special Prosecutor Randy McDonald opened with a promise. By the end of this trial, the jury would have no doubt, none whatsoever, that Kevin Edison Smith kidnapped, sexually assaulted, and murdered Krystal Jean Baker. The prosecution presented their case methodically. The DNA evidence, the testimony from the DPS crime lab explaining those 1,000,000,000 to 1 odds, the preserved dress with the semen stain that new technology had finally detected, the fingernail scrapings with Smith's DNA, the videotaped confession. The defense had little to work with. Smith didn't testify. His lawyer, Stephen Christopher Taylor, couldn't put him on the stand without opening the door to cross-examination about his confession and his decades of moving from city to city, refinery to refinery, woman to woman, girl to girl. Crime scene photos were shown. One juror was noticeably upset, according to court observers. Krystal's beaten face. The ligature marks. The small body crumpled on gravel. Jeannie Escamilla sat in the courtroom every day, flanked by her surviving children. Sometimes she wept. Sometimes she simply stared at Kevin Edison Smith with an intensity that made observers uncomfortable. This was the man who had strangled her daughter. This was the man who had robbed her of watching Krystal grow up, graduate, maybe have children of her own. On April 26, 2012, the case went to the jury. They deliberated for less than 40 minutes. Guilty on all counts. Capital murder. Because this crime had been committed under the 1996 Texas Penal Code, and because prosecutors had agreed to remove the death penalty from consideration, Judge Wilborn imposed the maximum sentence available, 40 years to life in prison. Under the law as it existed in 1996, 40 years was equivalent to life without the possibility of parole. Kevin Edison Smith would die in prison. After the verdict, Jeannie Escamilla and Krystal's brother, Jason Huggins, were allowed to address Smith directly. Jason went first. His statement isn't part of the public record, but witnesses described his voice as shaking with controlled rage. Then Jeannie Escamilla stood. She walked toward Kevin Edison Smith, close enough that bailiffs tensed, close enough that you could see Smith's jaw clench. "You aren't sorry for what you've done," Jeannie said. "You're evil, and you sat here and disrespected my daughter, my family, and your own family. She was my sunshine, and you took her away. Now I hope when you see the sun you think of that. The sun is no longer your friend. How can anyone be so evil?" Later, speaking to reporters, Jeannie added, "The devil may have taken her body, but God took her soul. I feel like I've walked through hell, looked the devil in the face, and told him off, and got to carry my daughter out of hell." She also said something else, something that hinted at the crusade to come. "He'll spend the rest of his life in prison, and I know that Krystal is cheering in heaven for that. But it shouldn't have taken 14 years. Jeannie Escamilla couldn't bring her daughter back. She knew that. She'd known it since March 5, 1996. But she could do something else. She could make sure other families didn't have to wait 14 years for justice. The key was Louisiana's law. The law that had caught Kevin Edison Smith. In Louisiana, they collected DNA at arrest, not after conviction. If Texas had that same law in 1996, would Smith have been caught then? Would other girls have been saved? Starting in 2013, prosecutors from the Chambers County District Attorney's Office, led by Cheryl Leek Henry and investigator Eric Carcerano, began making trips to Austin. They lobbied state legislators. They told Krystal's story over and over. They explained the science. They showed the numbers. Louisiana's law had caught Kevin Edison Smith. Similar laws in other states were solving cold cases at unprecedented rates. Why didn't Texas have this law? The opposition was predictable. Privacy advocates worried about collecting DNA from people who hadn't been convicted. What if they were innocent? What if the charges were dropped? Civil libertarians argued this was governmental overreach, a violation of Fourth Amendment protections against unreasonable search and seizure. But Jeannie Escamilla and the Chambers County prosecutors were persistent. They argued that DNA collection at arrest was no different from fingerprinting, which had been standard practice for over a century. They argued that the samples would be destroyed if charges were dropped or if the person was acquitted. They argued that the technology could solve rapes, murders, kidnappings, not just in Texas, but across state lines, anywhere CODIS was used. It took years. Bill after bill was introduced and failed. But they kept coming back. They kept telling Krystal's story. In 2019, Governor Greg Abbott signed House Bill 1399 into law. It was officially titled the Krystal Jean Baker Act. The law authorized the collection of DNA samples from individuals arrested and charged with any of 24 specific qualifying felonies. The samples would be immediately uploaded to CODIS, even before conviction. If charges were dropped or the person was acquitted, the DNA profile would be removed from the database and the physical sample destroyed. The law went into effect on September 1, 2019. Within the first 4 months of the Krystal Jean Baker Act's implementation, Texas law enforcement identified suspects in more than 45 unsolved cases. By the end of the first year, 250 cases closed. Not just in Texas, DNA matches popped up in South Carolina, New York, Arkansas, Idaho, Georgia, Oklahoma, Tennessee. A 17-year-old cold case strangulation in Lubbock County, solved. The suspect had been arrested on an unrelated charge, his DNA collected under the Baker Act, and matched to the homicide. He was also linked to a second homicide from 2004, a 25-year-old murder in Tarrant County, solved. The suspect had been arrested for aggravated assault in 2019. DNA taken under the Baker Act matched a murder from 1994 over a quarter-century old. 5 unsolved cases, aided by a DNA match from just 4 arrest events. Each individual had been arrested for a different crime, had their DNA collected, and was subsequently linked to unsolved violent crimes spanning years or decades. The statistics became staggering. In 2020, 66,984 offenders qualified to submit DNA under the Baker Act. In 2021, 75,777. In 2022, 80,869. As of the most recent data available, over 615 cases have been closed thanks to the Krystal Jean Baker Act. Burglaries, sexual assaults, homicides, cases that might never have been solved using traditional investigative methods. The counties with the highest number of DNA matches were predictable: Harris County, Houston, Dallas County, Tarrant County, Fort Worth, Travis County, Austin. The places with the highest populations also had the most violent crime, and now, finally, they had a tool to solve it. Senator Brandon Creighton, one of the law's sponsors, stated, "In the short time since this legislation was signed into law, Texas has collected thousands of new samples and made significant progress on unsolved cases. This is just the beginning." Representative Reggie Smith added, "I am pleased, but not surprised, that this legislation has already helped to identify the perpetrators of several unsolved violent crimes. I believe this legislation will provide for a safer Texas." And DPS Director Stephen McCraw said what everyone was thinking. By allowing us to collect and enter DNA evidence from offenders in a much quicker time frame, we are able to make a critical connection to previous crimes committed by the same offender. Quicker. That was the key word. Not 14 years. Not a decade of grief and unanswered questions. Days. Sometimes hours. The Baker Act proved so successful that in 2023, prosecutors went back to the legislature. This time, they pushed for expanded coverage, DNA collection for every felony arrest, not just the 24 qualifying offenses. That bill is still working its way through the system as of this writing, but the momentum is undeniable. Krystal Jean Baker's death had accomplished what her life never could. It had changed Texas law. It had saved lives. It had brought closure to hundreds of families. It had put predators in prison who might otherwise have walked free. Kevin Edison Smith sits in a Texas prison as I write this. He's 60 years old now. He'll be 84 before he's eligible for parole if he lives that long. The other inmates know what he did. Child killers aren't popular in prison. His life is measured in decades of looking over his shoulder, decades of knowing that Krystal Jean Baker's face is probably the last thing he'll see before he closes his eyes forever. The Texas killing fields haven't stopped producing bodies. Not entirely, but fewer now. DNA technology has made it harder to get away with murder along Interstate 45. Harder to snatch a girl from a convenience store. Harder to dump a body under a bridge and drive away into the Gulf Coast mist. In League City, the Calder Road field, where 4 bodies were found between 1983 and 1991, has been transformed. A local church now owns the land. Community members have created a memorial to the 4 women, Heidi Fye, Laura Miller, Audrey Lee Cook, and Donna Gonsoulin Prudhomme. Each has her own marker decorated with photos, names, and mementos. They're calling it the Healing Fields now, not the Killing Fields. Tim Miller, whose daughter Laura was murdered in 1984, founded Texas EquiSearch, a nonprofit organization that has helped locate over 400 missing people. He still visits the field. He still pushes for answers. He still believes justice hasn't been fully served for his daughter, or for many of the others. But there's hope now, real hope, the kind that comes from science and persistence and laws named after dead children. Jeannie Escamilla doesn't give many interviews anymore. The Investigation Discovery Channel featured Krystal's case on their series Nightmare Next Door in April of 2013. The Netflix docuseries Crime Scene, The Texas Killing Fields, included her story. Each time, Jeannie participates, telling her daughter's story once more, hoping it will prevent another family from enduring what she endured. In one interview, she said, "I was raised in the church and taught to forgive, but that's hard. So I'm trying to just rejoice in the time I had with Krystal and let go of the, to find peace with her." She never finished that sentence. How do you finish a sentence about forgiving the man who strangled your daughter? But Jeannie Escamilla found another way to make peace, not through forgiveness, through action, through legislation, through ensuring that Kevin Edison Smith's capture wouldn't be the end of the story, but the beginning of something larger. The Krystal Jean Baker Act isn't just a law, it's a promise. It's a memorial written in legal code. It's a 13-year-old girl's final gift to her state, delivered posthumously through her mother's grief and determination. When you drive Interstate 45 between Houston and Galveston today, you'll see the refineries still burning, the bayous still hiding their secrets, the fields still stretching endlessly toward the Gulf. But you'll also see something else, if you know where to look. Billboard campaigns about missing persons. Amber Alert signs flashing information about abducted children. Surveillance cameras at convenience stores. And underneath it all, invisible but powerful, a DNA database that's growing larger every single day. 615 cases and counting. 615 families who got answers. 615 predators who couldn't disappear into the American highway system the way they once could. All because a 13-year-old girl with Marilyn Monroe's cheekbones and a rebellious streak walked out of her grandmother's house on a March afternoon in 1996. All because her mother refused to let her memory die. All because a deputy named Sherry Wilcox refused to let the evidence gather dust. All because Louisiana had a law that Texas didn't until Texas learned the hard way why they needed it. Krystal Jean Baker was murdered on March 5, 1996. The Krystal Jean Baker Act became law on September 1, 2019. 23 years, 5 months, and 27 days separated the two events. But in those years between tragedy and triumph, between death and legislation, between one girl's murder and hundreds of cases solved, something remarkable happened. Krystal Jean Baker became more powerful in death than she ever could have been in life. She became a law. She became justice. She became the girl who changed Texas. And that, ultimately, is how we remember her. Not as another victim in the Texas killing fields. Not as a statistic in a cold case file. Not even as the great-grandniece of Marilyn Monroe, though that detail adds its own tragic Hollywood poetry to the story. We remember Krystal Jean Baker as the girl whose death saved lives. The girl whose name appears in Texas legal code. The girl who, through her mother's crusade and her state's belated but genuine commitment to justice, ensured that other mothers wouldn't have to wait 14 years for answers. The sun is no longer Kevin Edison Smith's friend, but it still shines on Texas. And somewhere in that Texas sunshine, in the code of law and the strands of DNA and the solved cases stacking up year after year, Krystal Jean Baker is still here, still fighting, still saving lives. One DNA sample at a time.